Continue our coverage on the recall election results, getting some perspective from our News 8's political panel.
Political analysts Laura Fink and Wendy Patrick join us here this morning. Good morning, ladies. Thanks so much for being here.
Good morning.
So it appears to be an overwhelming victory for the governor. What is your initial reaction, Laura, to these results?
Well, the pollsters were right. I know we always take them down a notch when they're wrong, but in this case, they were spot on. It really was a mandate with north of 60% of the vote against the recall and for Governor Newsom, and just south of 40% to remove him from office. I think this was in the end driven by national themes with the president and vice president coming, and with the key issues, masks and vaccines, and the national politics of the right versus the local politics of the left. So maybe a harbinger for what's to come in the midterms.
Wendy, a tough night for the GOP candidates.
You know, it really was. And, you know, you talk about what the race was about. It really did come down to national versus local in several respects. First of all, I mean, California is a deep blue state. You did have national support actually come to San Diego as well as everywhere else in the form of the president and the vice president. You didn't see national support for Larry Elder. Now, there may have been a variety of reasons why, but you wonder whether this was a governor's race or a COVID referendum, because that was a lot of the issues that were being discussed, both on the left and on the right. But I do have to say, although Governor Newsom ran away with it, I don't think he's doing a victory lap. I think he's breathing a sigh of relief, given the way the polls changed just in the last month when we were talking in July that it was almost evenly split. That wasn't a comfortable place for him to be.
Laura, what do you think made Newsom's strategy so successful, and is the nation watching this one very closely?
Great question. I think it was really about clearing the field of Democrats. So he didn't have a prominent Democrat running in that replacement category. I think also you have to look at women. If you look at the polling data prior to the election, men by a skinny majority favored removing him from office, but a landslide of women supported him. North of 66% in some polls supported keeping the governor in office. So he should be writing a thank you note to the women of California who kept him in that governor's office.
Wendy?
I think he should be writing a thank you note to voters. That was one of the problems that he faced going into this race, is there was a lot of apathy. There was complacency among the Democrats, who far outnumber the Republicans. So simply by getting those people to the polls to begin with, whether they're mailing in their ballots or they're voting on election day, they made the difference in this race. But I have to say, Newsom is facing re-election next year. This should never have qualified for the ballot, is something that he's probably thinking. And that makes all elected leaders vulnerable, at least knowing that he faces this type of an uphill battle, potentially.
Wendy, we'll stick with you on this. What does this say about the Republican base? Did they not have the right candidate to drum up support, or are they just purely outnumbered here in California? And what has to happen for that to change?
Yeah, Eric, I think they're outnumbered. You know, for that to change, there has to be widespread discontent, as there was last summer when Gavin Newsom instituted all those rules and regulations via COVID. And then, of course, we have the famous French Laundry incident. But ideally, that turned the tide in his favor with the emergence of the Delta variant, because all of a sudden people were saying, you know, maybe masks aren't such a bad idea if they'll drive our numbers down. And Eric and Stella, the numbers did go down. And so he did gain a little bit of credibility. Who knows to what extent those turned the numbers around in the election as well. But he has to really stick with it and appeal bipartisan. I know easier said than done, but that would be something he can do to make sure he stays in office next year.
Laura, one last quick thought.
Well, you know, I think you got to look at Larry Elder consolidating that Republican vote at 47%. So you may say that he and I have said that perhaps he was too far right to really win that mandate and get some crossover votes. But you're looking at a candidate that consolidated that Republican base, and maybe someone we'll see in the future.
Okay, Laura, Wendy, thank you so much for joining us this morning and having this conversation.
Thank you.
Glad to see you.